This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV, it's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York. First, before we get started today, our hearts go out to all the people affected by Hurricane Helene. Not only did it devastate coastal areas in Florida, but inland flooding was biblical in nature. The Foul Weather Podcast thanks all first responders, linemen, and the volunteers helping in the long road to recovery. I myself am just back from South Carolina, where I rode out the storm in the Ace Basin, or the Ashepoo, Combahee, and Edisto basins, one of the largest undeveloped estuaries along the Atlantic coast. It was a productive trip to a place very rich in waterfowling history. While there, I gave a talk about weather severity and duck migration, as well as some highlights about mallard genetics and migration at a waterfowl workshop at the Nemours Wildlife Foundation. So today, we will highlight the message from that talk in this episode. At the end, we provide the first of many duck migration forecasts that come out each week at the Foul Weather Podcast until the end of January. We also provide a sobering update about our yellow lab Jager's liver issue. All this and much more on today's episode of the Foul Weather Podcast. We thank our every week listeners. You know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning. We appreciate y'all very, very much. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at. Think about that. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks even know where they're at. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days of the week to hunt because the Foul Weather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. So the bad news first here, folks. If you follow the Foul Weather Podcast, you know that we've been battling a mysterious liver disease in our 7-year-old yellow lab, Jager, also known as Baby Jager, also known as Peanut, also known as Baby Peanut, because she's only about 48 pounds. We call her a pocket lab. We went through a lot of stuff, ruling out a bunch of things. We first caught her high ALT values indicative of liver damage when we ran a senior blood panel on her when she hit 6 years old. So this has now been going on for almost a year. You know, ultrasounds, a liver biopsy, and many blood draws to track down what's going on. We ruled out copper storage disease, which is really kind of common in female yellow labs at about age 6. And now, after lots of different things we've been trying, we're down to an autoimmune disorder that is causing her immune system to chronically attack her liver. We do have the immune suppressants, but we're really looking to hold off starting them until a few, duck hunts in New York and then our trip to North Dakota. Unfortunately, her ALT values went from around 800, they should be less than 130, by the way, to 1,300 in about a month. So not a good sign. But if she cannot make another year with us for whatever reason, we're at least going to get her one good North Dakota hunt. Then after we get back from North Dakota, we're going to put her on those, immune suppressants for a month to see what it does to those ALT values. So our old boy, Dr. Zug, he's a big old 90-pound, yellow lab. He may have to come out of retirement this year, no matter his old age kidney issues or his seizures from epilepsy that he has. He may be the go-to as, we're careful about exposing Jager to too much in the marsh that might compromise her immune system when she's on those immune suppressants. Anyhow, not good, but she continues to remain asymptomatic, running, farm trails, sleeping on the porch in the sun, and taking on daily training sessions like a champ. She's just a superstar. All right, moving on, though. We will always work to give Jager the best dog life, and, we'll keep everybody posted on her health and adventures this season. So thanks for those of you who have written us. We actually we have a veterinarian from Maryland, a retired veterinarian that has written to us, and several other comments from folks, wishing us luck. Other people having these types of things go on with their dogs, too. It's not always easy, but our lives are better with them than without them, for sure. I'd also like to note that at the Foul Weather Podcast, we are moving on for now from the discussions about duck harvest, waterfall surveys, AHM, and so on, because we think we've made our point that we follow the science and aim to inform listeners when incorrect, misleading, or politically charged information permeates your wavelengths. So we're moving on and focusing on our continued quality content on waterfowl migration, waterfowl habitat management, and all things ducks and duck hunting to bring you the best information possible to make decisions about the best days to hunt this season. The Foul Weather Podcast aims to entertain and inform, but we always take the inform portion very seriously. If we hear a bunch of BS again or wild speculation, we're not going to back down from ensuring the great people across duck country are properly informed about how waterfowl management works. Yeah, so as the good weather nerd that I am, it was interesting to fly into South Carolina and be on the east side of Helene on Thursday night into Friday. We finished up the talks at that workshop at Nemours on Thursday and had good company of old friends and a bunch of new friends, too, that I made that night over fine bourbon, and talked ducks, duck habitat management, and all this well into the night. And we went to bed kind of, I'd say, right before the wind and the rain hit from Helene, kind of halfway between Charleston and Savannah. But we did wake up to worse damage than expected. Not just trees down, but berms at the plantation washing away and tidal impoundments, tornadoes down trees and power lines throughout much of coastal South Carolina. And again, our hearts really do go out to all the people affected, including those that lost loved ones in the storm. While we certainly see tropical systems as a way to catch water, and we've talked about that on the Foul Weather Podcast because that water does help ducks in some places, this weather also equally drowns out crops, blows out berms in others. It's pure chaos in some places and a blessing in others. So think of it this way, right? We don't control the weather at the Foul Weather Podcast. We just report. And we understand that hurricane season is not kind to so many. And we certainly never wish to sound flippant about the real effects on people's lives. Just like the weather each year that varies and gives some people ducks and others not, hurricanes provide much needed water inland at times to make duck habitat, and at the same time create real loss for others. That is not lost on us at the Foul Weather Podcast.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
Podcast. The talk I provided was to inform South Carolina constituents about how weather variability affects the ducks they see each migration season in fall and winter. We really kind of summarized decades of our own research as well as that of colleagues. The tours of the tidal impoundment system and farther up those freshwater systems provided me the opportunity to see that food availability in South Carolina low country was not the problem, especially in a benign place where weather is not harsh enough that ducks have to feed all the time. Here's a quick rundown of the talk provided. It started with showing a substantial decline in mallard harvest in South Carolina, whereas green-winged teal trajectory went the other way and gadwall harvest was up too, becoming what a lot are calling the new mallard of South Carolina in recent years. Of note, not all that decline in mallard harvest in South Carolina can be explained by weather, and I'll get into that later in the episode. Early in the week, before I went and gave that talk, I also dug into the age ratios in the harvest of South Carolina out of interest, and was astonished by the high number of juveniles per adult compared to nearby states. When North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia were shooting typically in the range of one or less juvenile per adult mallards, South Carolina was at 2.4, 1.5, 1.2, 1.2, 1.2, 2.8, and 5.0 from 2016 to 2023, respectively. This was kind of a head-scratcher at first. But it hit me. South Carolina probably releases more game farm mallards than most states. I mean, that number of juveniles per adult doesn't even happen in New York, where mallards breed. So this must be the abundance of game farm releases of juvenile mallards showing up in that Fish and Wildlife Service data. More on this topic when we loop back to mallard genetics and duck migration towards the end of this section. Next, I highlighted the great work by various researchers out there looking at, changes in duck migration from various different angles, banding, count data, all those types of things. The good folks at the University of Missouri, along with Heath Hagee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, used band returns to estimate changes in the distribution of mallards during winter. A lot of nuances here, folks, and I can't cover them all. But their findings showed that for mallards in January, that on average, the distribution of those band returns had shifted north, but not as dramatically as one might expect. There was, however, a blob of band recoveries in the Great Lakes region that was not there in the 1960s. So there's something going on for sure. There's movement of these birds north, and it's showing up in the band recoveries. But again, not drastic, but there's this blob of recoveries in the Great Lakes region too. There's also the problem of ducks with bands remaining at northern latitudes more now than before when a state's season closes. That duck can't be recovered, right? So how much this shifts kind of that estimate point north, I'm not really sure. But certainly it can only move the average recovery latitude one direction, and that's north. And we know that banded mallards remain here into winter after waterfowl season closes. The next slide we showed was a similar analysis from the Canadian Wildlife Service that used Canadian banded mallards to determine how that migration had changed. That analysis actually detected that recoveries had expanded south in October compared to normal, but then by January, just like the University of Missouri study, had expanded north. That is, banded mallards were being recovered farther south in the migration, earlier in the migration season, but farther north later in the migration period. So this seems to be a migration range contraction whereby mallards are spending more time in mid-latitudes than before. So what do I think's going on here? I'm going to speculate, right? I do think we've done very well at restoring and maintaining quality stopover locations at mid-latitudes. And adult ducks may be reacting to this by homing back into those places and maybe even earlier in the migration season to take advantage of those food resources. Second, that cold front that came through in October last year, it kind of swept down out of Canada into the Dakotas. My wife was stuck in Williston. If you were longtime listeners, my wife was stuck in Williston, North Dakota, in that snowstorm, trying to fly back with a cooler full of mule deer from a hunt in Montana, and couldn't get out for a while. And that was like a really early, pretty strong cold shot in October. But this is, the thought, I talked about it last year too. This is really a way for the planet to equilibrate in kind of a warming planet. The Arctic still cools each year, so there's a good potential. It's kind of like a climate change signal in a weird feedback loop that's fairly complex, right? So we might actually be getting earlier cold fronts too, but after that it seems to equilibrate because we know that our winters have gotten warmer. Last, before jumping into our own work on weather severity indices, we also highlighted some research that came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that used Christmas bird count data, or ground count data by the birding community that occurs around Christmas each year. That study determined if abundances of ducks had changed through time during the Christmas bird count. What they detected were substantial increases in ducks at northern latitude states coupled with declines in the south, and that about 50% of the variation in those abundances was explained by temperature alone. Again, nuances, changes species by species, but the general trend was during the time around Christmas, more birds in the north since the 1960s than now, and less ducks at southern latitudes during that period around Christmas over time. I then highlighted our own collaborative work detailing how the weather severity indices were developed species by species, and that the area in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways that had weather severity indices great enough to cause migration of ducks south, well, that weather severity had declined through time. That statement, though, is also nuanced because there is still a lot of variability among years. The declines in weather severity indices from 1980 until recently were significant for most species and months, but there was still a lot of variation in weather severity between years. But here's the deal. Overall, the harsh years had become less harsh, and the mild years had become milder. We also used standard duck energy calculations to estimate that about 1.65 million mallard, black duck, and pintail-sized ducks could remain farther north at mid-latitudes and not come south now compared to the 1980s. Said another way, 1.65 million big ducks that don't come south and be in front of your blind because the weather that causes their migration had become milder. The Weather Severity Index section of the talk was ended with a study that we collaborated on with the University of Wisconsin Center for Climatic Research that showed that in a warming climate, dabbling ducks would on average migrate anywhere from 12 to 19 days later out of the Great Lakes region by the year 2050. And by 2100, 23 days later at minimum for our early migrants. But for big ducks, like mallards, there was a greater likelihood that on any given year, they would never have to leave the Great Lakes region. So we answered the question, has duck migration changed? And the answer, I'd say, is easily yes. Duck migration has in fact changed over the last several decades. On the other side, I detail how game farm mallards may be contributing to the decline in migration, so please stick with us. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with the Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the Foul Weather Podcast sent you their way. I then detailed work conducted in collaboration with Dr. Phil Lavretsky, the duck DNA guy, about mallard genetics. We probably all now know the story that the genetic composition of mallards in eastern North America and most of the Atlantic flyway specifically has been greatly changed by releasing mallards bred for the purpose of shooting, game farm mallards, that are of European descent. The Atlantic coast is now a hybrid swarm of game farm crossed with wild mallard genetics, with most ducks being between 70 to 90% wild, or said another way, having a substantial input of game farm genetics and continually back-crossing with each other in that 70 to 90 degree range. So why does this matter? From our own lab at ESF, In collaboration with Mississippi State University and Forbes Biological Station, we found that game farm and wild mallards are very physically distinct. When compared to wild mallards, game farm mallards have longer bodies, shorter wings, longer legs, shorter, wider, and taller bills. The nail on the bill is longer, and their heads are shorter. In feeding trials, when presented natural-sized seeds in a mud mix to mimic wetland conditions, we found that game farm mallards ingest food at about 50% of the rate of wild mallards. Their bills, the game farm mallards' bills, are built like that of a goose, good at picking grains and pellets, but not so good for straining food in a wetland. Then we detailed work by Ben Luukkonen, his great PhD work from Michigan, that showed that increasing contribution of game farm mallard genes was negatively associated with migration distance and tendency to migrate at all. So looping back to South Carolina declining mallard harvest that we started this episode with, that can't all be explained by weather alone, as I stated. Also, 68% of South Carolina's mallard harvest comes from locations to the north with substantial game farm mallard influence. So why aren't South Carolinians shooting mallards anymore? Yeah, it's gotten warmer, and the migration has changed, but even on those cold years, the mallard to the north of them has less of a tendency to migrate because it has game farm genes. So then, how do you shoot mallards in South Carolina? You release more of these what I like to call manky mallards, probably making the problem worse instead of better. When we finished up, lots of great questions from the engaged crowd kind of rounded out the day before we dispersed. It was a wonderful workshop with great hospitality from my friends in the duck country of South Carolina. That evening, I learned more about rice trunks, how they work to manage tidal impoundments, but, just too much here to dissect today. Hopefully we can have the good folks from Nemours Wildlife Foundation on the Foul Weather Podcast in the future to talk low country ducks and duck management. Next up, the first of many duck migration forecasts. So be sure to hang with us. Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The Foul Weather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at foulweather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. And here we go, the first migration forecast of many. Nearly every forecast out there right now has us warmer than normal through November, which for the most part is kind of playing out so far this fall. We're, hitting the 1st of October here, and we're still picking the last of our okra at the farm in central New York, right? Good stuff for gumbo, kind of weird for us at this northern latitude. Certainly a sign of a warm year. Warm and dry seems to be the norm on the western portion of the Canadian prairies, and other than the northeast U.S., it really looks like most everyone in duck country is going to be dry for the coming week. The mid-latitude portions of the central flyway really need rain, with many areas under a red flag warning or high fire danger warning. The teal season has ended, and it was a really mixed bag, with lots of folks having hardly any teal and others covered up. I heard about folks in Maryland already piled up with green-wing teal, not blue wings, but green wings. They also just seem to be, very spread out from north to south, specifically talking about those blue wings. My wife and I drove around Montezuma yesterday. We ran the dogs on some trails out there, but we also stopped and talked with some of the youth waterfowl hunters and their mentors as they left the marsh. Yesterday was the youth waterfowl season in New York. We don't put it at the end. We do a veterans thing at the end, but we don't jam kids in the marsh in January around here because it can be pretty rough out there, right? I'm recording on Sunday. Today is the second day of that youth hunt. So that's wrapping up for us. And then our season actually here in New York opens October 12th. But the kids and their mentors said they had crazy numbers of blue wings around, which I typically see around the beginning of September when we're rail hunting in those marshes. And then they're gone, but they seem to still be sticking around. On the flip side, we usually have good numbers of pintails right now, along with some green wings and widgeon, but they seem down in numbers for this time of the year. On the other hand, I've also already heard of reports of pintails kind of in the MAV, Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So some weird stuff going on early this year for sure. Maybe those weird weather patterns from last year have adult ducks, ducks that have survived a few years and thinking about last year, making odd first movements this year in response to that kind of early weather last year and horrible drought in some places. Not exactly sure, but it's certainly not about weather at this point pushing them, right? The bright spot this week for duck migration is our farthest west monitoring in the Pacific Flyway. I said we'd do some Pacific Flyway stuff this year. I've added some weather stations out there to track, and I think we've got our finger on the pulse of it. But those areas in the Pacific Flyway where there's ducks this week and earlier than this, certainly moving out of Alaska, and even Alberta is seeing cold enough to move early dabbling ducks. But as soon as we get into like Idaho and Washington State, those weather severity values are not great enough to cause movement farther south in the Pacific Flyway at this point. That said, right, early cold, indicative of a La Nina pattern, is pushing out of Alaska this week and into the western prairies of Canada. So there should be a small wave of ducks into Montana, the Dakotas, and northern portions of the Pacific Flyway this week. The best bet is look for north or northwest winds throughout the week. The weather severity index values are about the same. This is all temperature driven. It's not snow driven at all. So, a good nighttime cold with a north or northwest wind the next day or day after that is going to be your best bet, right? Everyone else is just really, really warm in general without much rain for most of those areas. So some early movements, but nothing spectacular yet. And if you haven't caught up, have a listen to last week's episode, episode 51, or episode 6, A Tale of Two Migrations, which details why ducks are starting to move even in the absence of cold and snow at this point. Also remember that you can find waterfowl season information for every state and province at our one-stop shop at foulweather.co/seasons. That's foulweather.co/seasons. We also want to give a shout out to our friends at Northern Latitude Foods. Remember that you can use our Foul Weather 2024 discount code to get 10% off from Northern Latitude Foods. So get you some wild rice to go with that duck dinner this coming season. This is some of the most robust flavored wild rice we've ever tasted. That discount code for 10% off from Northern Latitude Foods is Foul Weather 2024. All one word, FOWL WEATHER 2024 for your 10% discount. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.